Hello and welcome to the MyHeritage webinar series. I'm Jeff Rasmussen, your host, broadcasting to you live from webinar headquarters in Middleton, Idaho. Today we have Mike Mansfield with us for the topic of Discover Your Family in School Yearbooks. Thanks to Mike and thanks to all of you, more than 1,400 of you from 22 countries around the world have registered for today's webinar. So wherever and whenever you are, thanks for sharing part of your day with us. I'm happy to welcome Mike Mansfield to the show. Mike is Director of Content Operations at MyHeritage since 2013. In this role, he is responsible for defining the company's strategy for growing its collection of now 9 billion historical records and supervising all operations of content acquisition. Previously, Mike held a senior product manager role at Family Search. His professional career has been heavily focused in electronic publishing, search and retrieval, and content acquisition and strategy. After completing his B.S. in computer science at Brigham Young University, he worked for Folio Corporation, a Provo, Utah-based technology company, which developed cutting-edge CD-ROM publication and search technology. Mike joined Ancestry in 1999 and held key roles in its development of the search engine and publication platform still in use today. And as the Senior Director of Search and Content, he led this team that created the record hinting system, which helped to revolutionize the way in which users interact with online genealogical records. Mike continued to develop his expertise in his roles in Family Search and MyHeritage. So please put together your virtual hands and let's give Mike Mansfield a nice warm webinar welcome. Mike, how are you, and welcome to the show.
Great. It's good to be with you, Jeff. I hope my screen's showing properly now. Let's see. Click on that.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, it looks great, Mike.
Great.
Well, an interesting topic, and we're all excited about this and glad to have you here. So the time's all yours, Mike.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really excited to spend this time. It's kind of rare that we actually get to do sort of a really deep dive into a specific record type like this. So this is a fun opportunity for me. I really enjoy these two images that I have on my title slide here. These are held by the National Museum in one of the Smithsonian Museums in Washington. On the left, you see sort of a comprehensive school of probably kindergarten all the way through age 12. And on the right, likely the same school's interior, even with its potbelly stove. Just a quite quaint scene. This is likely from Mount Pleasant, Ohio in the early 20th century. All right, so the overview, as I said, we're going to do a deep dive into this topic. I'm really excited to share with you some of the information that I have learned and discovered in my usage of these amazing resources. We'll first talk a little bit about yearbooks in their historical context. Yearbooks as genealogical sources. I'll also show you some examples to kind of get your blood pumping and help you see what the potentials are that you can learn. We'll also talk about some search strategies for searching these records that are digitized or maybe are not digitized yet. And then also finding yearbook collections both online and offline. And then at the end, just a few words about copyright and copyright issues that we just probably need to bear in mind. All right, so let's talk just a few moments about yearbooks and their historical context. So as I think about this, it's an interesting intersection of a social, political, and a technological innovation that occurred really in the late 1800s here in the United States. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So first of all, the main social political innovation is that of compulsory public education that occurred. And then we'll also talk about some of the innovations in the photographic processes that made these photographic yearbooks possible. So prior to the latter quarter of the 19th century, high schools had a very limited existence in the United States. The high schools that did exist often had an entrance examination process which restricted their ability to serve the population to fewer than 5% of students that might be eligible by age. Most high schools in the country were private and beyond the financial reach of most families. And these few high schools serve student populations in mostly affluent, large city urban environments such as Boston, New York City, Baltimore, Philadelphia, these large population centers where there's both a concentration of people and people of significant financial affluence. Prior to this change that happened in the late 19th century into the early 20th century, most students, upon completion of what are considered the elementary grades, so this is the grades of kindergarten or first grade through grades approximately 6th through 8th grade, were expected to be educationally ready for a job or family. This sounds kind of quaint to us now, where we often go to school for quite a large portion of our lives to not only graduate from high school, but also perhaps college and university degrees. So in 1892, an important event happened. A working group of educators known as the Committee of 10 was established by the National Education Association. The National Education Association, or the NEA, is still today the largest professional interest group in the United States, and was actually founded in 1857. It was known then as the National Teachers Association. This committee recommended 12 years of instruction consisting of 8 years of elementary education and 4 years of high school. Throughout my presentation today, I'll be using interchangeably the term high school and secondary education. So technically, when we speak about secondary education, we're talking about the grades 9, 10, 11, and 12, which are often the exact same grades that are serviced by high schools. Certainly, there are many high schools in the country that do just the grades 10, 11, and 12, and the 9th grade is serviced by perhaps a junior high. Still, 9th grade is still considered secondary education and technically part of the high school curriculum. They also recommended the standardization of high school curriculum across the country. An important thing that they also took up is this sort of educational philosophy of should they divide students into college-bound and working trade cohorts really from the start. And this was rejected by the committee. I know that this model is in use in certain European countries today, however. They did reaffirm the social and legislative movement that was occurring in the country to pass state laws to make schooling through grade 12 compulsory. I have a hard time saying that word. So let's talk about education in the States. So this compulsory school attendance laws, they were first passed by the state of Massachusetts in 1852. By 1900, or the turn of the century, 32 states had passed these compulsory education laws. And the last state, Mississippi, passed its state law in 1917. Another important historical phenomenon that occurred is what's commonly referred to as the high school movement. This is a term in the history of education to describe the time period approximately from 1910 to 1940. And during this time period, there were many, many high schools that were built across the United States, really in compliance with these state laws that had been passed. In 1910, only 19% of 15 to 18-year-olds were enrolled in a high school, with approximately just 9% graduating. By 1940, the percentage had grown quite a bit to 73% of American youth population were enrolled, with approximately half or just better than half were graduating with a high school diploma. And then by the 1970s and 80s, we're well over 95% enrollment, with graduation rates that were hovering around the 80% mark. Just some numbers on the number of secondary schools. Again, these are both public high schools and private high schools. Some of the latest statistics that I've been able to find are from a 2001 publication from the U.S. Department of Education. In this digest of education statistics, they show approximately 26,000 public high schools and 10,600 or so private high schools, or again, same thing as secondary schools. Next, let's talk about the innovation that occurred in photography. So one of the first photographic techniques that was invented was the daguerreotype, invented by Monsieur Daguerre, who lived from 1787 and died in 1851. He's shown here on the right in a daguerreotype of himself that was taken by one of his colleagues. This photographic technique became extremely popular in the United States, even more so than in France and Europe, where it had originated. And in New York City, especially, where in the late 1850s you could find hundreds of daguerreotypists vying for clients. They built lavish portrait studios in buildings on and off Broadway and in other major American cities. The quality of this daguerreotype process was really quite excellent. A well-trained daguerreotypist in a nice studio with proper lighting and the development process as well mastered could produce images of remarkable quality. You'll know that you're looking at a daguerreotype if you see it in a frame like this. The silver plate that actually holds the image is quite easily scratched, and so these daguerreotypists would sell them in a frame like this where there would be a piece of glass encased covering up the actual silver plate to protect it. There were some drawbacks though from this photographic technique. The first one is the subject had to hold still for quite a long time. The early part of the technique's use of this exposure time could be measured in many minutes, maybe even as long as 5 minutes. They started to use devices like this shown on the right to hold the subject's head still and to help them sit comfortably during a long exposure. It's also difficult, if not impossible, to make copies and accurate copies of these daguerreotypes. And finally, the development process involved using quite a large quantity of mercury vapor. So similar to water, mercury boils at a fairly low boiling point, and just like water produces steam, when you boil mercury, you get a vapor. And this vapor is what they discovered they could use to develop these silver plates that had been exposed through the cameras that this daguerreotype used. One of the main drawbacks of using mercury, though, as we now know, is that mercury exposure, really at even small levels, can be harmful to the brain, the nervous system, the heart, kidneys, lungs, and the immune system. So just a minor drawback there is the process was actually quite poisonous. The advent of the photographic yearbook can be traced back to one gentleman, a fairly well-known daguerreotypist who took up the some of the early photographic processes. His name was George K. Warren, who died in 1884. He was an early American daguerreotypist who had experience with that process, who was quite an innovative individual and saw a way to make a new business where he could sell copies of photographs using this new Collodon process, which allowed for the production of many images from a single negative. So as a good entrepreneur, he invented his own market. Being based in Boston, he first started to persuade college students, mostly then at the time, to sit for portraits, and then they would subsequently buy many copies of their own portraits and then share or trade them with their classmates. And then these college men would have these images bound by a bookbinder into ornate albums. Here's one of the earliest known examples. This was a book acquired by the National Museum of American History in 2003. It's of a Rutgers University 1860 school yearbook. At the time, there were just 28 graduating seniors. The picture here of George McNeil, he was just one of a handful of 3 young Texas men who had attended Rutgers prior to the Civil War. He did join the Confederate Army and eventually rose to the rank of major, but died in action in 1864. So let's look at yearbooks as genealogical sources. And whenever we look at a record type or a document type, we need to ask ourselves some questions about primary and secondary evidence. This mental exercise also helps us wring out all of the information that these sources contain and helps us think about what we're learning critically. It also can lead us to creating really nice citations for the information that we find. So as an analogy, I want to do this study really quickly of a death certificate. And we'll look at the primary and secondary information that we would find in a death certificate, just as an example. Let me blow this up. So this is the death certificate for Henry Ford, the well-known industrialist, founder and president of the Ford Motor Company. So primary sources are the raw materials that historians use in historical research. They are the documents and artifacts that were created closest to the topic of investigation. They're often created during the time period or very near to the time period which is being studied. They could also be produced later, however, by eyewitnesses or participants at that event. A primary source certainly provides direct or first-hand evidence about an event object or person. And we can compare that with secondary sources or secondary information, which offer an analysis or a restatement of primary sources. They often attempt to describe or explain primary sources. Some secondary sources not only analyze primary sources, but also use them to argue or persuade the reader to hold a certain opinion. So as such, secondary sources are not evidence, but are rather commentary on and discussion of evidence. So let's look at the differences that we see in this death certificate. So here at the top, we see the name of the decedent, Henry Ford. We could claim that that's primary information in this document. We also get a place of death. Again, this document was generated very near to the time of death, within days. So the informants almost certainly knew the place of death, and then we also have the date of death, again, information that would have been almost certainly to be correct as they recorded the document. We get information about Henry Ford's cause of death and burial, including the date that he was buried. Other information here, such as Henry Ford's birth date, is what I would argue to be secondary information in this document. So someone, likely the informant who's listed on this document as Mrs. Henry Ford or Henry Ford's wife, may be remembering what she had known about her husband. This information could certainly be accurate, but it could also be questioned. Also, same thing with the birthplace. And then finally, as we see here, the informant, again, Mrs. Ford, probably supplied information to the registrar about information about Mr. Ford's parents. And you'll notice here that Mr. Ford's mother has an unknown birthplace, an example of where the informant is uncertain of this information that was passed on to him or her. All right, so as we look at yearbooks, what primary sources can we expect to find? And you'll certainly see some examples in just a moment. Certainly primary for school attendance. Knowing that our family member or ancestor attended school is information that we can use in other genealogical pursuits, perhaps even looking for school records from perhaps a school district archive that may exist. Knowing what grade level they attended school through, if they actually completed say high school, or if they did drop out to pursue a career. And then one of the most important things that we'll see are certainly portraits and other photographic images. And what make yearbooks very helpful is they almost always have identifying name labels that we can associate with the persons shown in the photographs. We also can get some nice information about name preference and usage. So we all know people. I'm one of these. My official first name is Michael. I generally and almost always go by the name Mike. And so that's an example where we could see what name I liked to be called as I was a student, if I was able to specify that as it was published in the yearbook. We can also learn about academic, athletic, and extracurricular interests of our family and ancestors. And for teachers and staff, or the adults that work at the school, we certainly get information about their occupation in the educational field. Secondary sources that we'll see are residents. So we certainly know where these schools are located, and we know the cities and even counties that they're located, but we need to be a little cautious here. Some schools serve students in rural populations where they may have come from outlying cities, towns, or villages to attend the school in the city where it was located. So I'd argue that residence is something that is not primary, but still we get great information about residence events and information in these yearbooks. We can also deduce some information about age. So we generally know the age of when the students attended the various grade levels, and we can do some easy math to get back to an approximate birth year, and I'll show an example of that in a little bit. As I mentioned, we can estimate birth year. Sometimes we'll see what I call a historical prediction. So an example may be in the senior class section, the seniors may be saying, I'm going to this college, I'm going to join the Army. These things that haven't happened yet when the yearbook was published, but sort of the student's best guess or information about what they were planning to do. Not that those events all came to pass, but can certainly lead us to look for other sources of information based on what they stated they might want to pursue after their school career is over. or after their high school career is over primarily. We can also get some hints to relationships to possible siblings and cousins, and I should add here even love interests, and I'll show you some interesting examples of that in just a few moments. All right, so let's look at who we're going to learn about in these yearbooks, and predominantly we're going to learn about students. The collections that we'll talk about here are mostly from U.S. high schools or secondary schools, or schools that contain primarily the grades 9, 10, 11, and 12. And again, as I mentioned earlier, some high schools only have the last three grades, others have the last 4. So freshmen, who are generally aged 14 to 15, are in the 9th grade. Sophomores aged 15 to 16 are in the 10th grade. Juniors, etc., 11th grade, with seniors ages 17 to 18 in the 12th grade. Those are sort of the standard ages. We know that there's exceptions where some students maybe accelerated a little bit and go and finish early, and others may be held back a year or so. In these yearbooks, we'll often see the class names for freshmen and sophomore, also called underclassmen, where juniors and seniors can be labeled upperclassmen. We'll also learn some interesting information about the adults that worked at these schools, such as the administrators and faculty. So these include principals, vice principals, the teachers, coaches, and then staff that also work at and service the school in a number of ways. They're often shown with photographs, and it's fairly nice to see those adults who are also there at the school. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how these were created and who created them. So most of these schools offered an elective journalism class, and the students in these journalism classes worked on both the school newspaper and the yearbook. I think later it was common to also see high schools offering just a yearbook class, where they sort of segmented the journalism curriculum into 2 pieces, the newspaper separate from the yearbook. The photography that was done in the yearbooks was often conducted by a professional photographer in a studio or in a portable studio installed in the school. I should say the portrait photography. Other photos were certainly taken by student photographers and included in the yearbook. Group photography, I'll show some examples of this in just a moment, was also usually done by a local professional as well. And then other photographs would have taken by students and included. And the yearbook page design, the layouts, the typography was generally done by students, often with their teacher mentorship or oversight. But as you'll see, almost anything that the mind of a teenager can imagine, you're going to see in these yearbooks as far as page layout and design. If there's a consistency in yearbooks, is that there is no consistency in the way that they portray the information. So yeah, we'll see all sorts of different permutations of layout as we get into some examples. So let's look at some examples. I'll show you some individual portraits. Especially of note here is the senior class. So the senior class are often given special treatment in these yearbooks from the United States. So the graduating class was asked to sometimes even go to a studio that was not located at the school, perhaps in the city, the studio of a professional photographer, where they sometimes were even asked or required to dress with a certain type of almost tuxedo or a dress, very formal type of shot. Sometimes they're wearing a cap and gown. But I always recommend to people when they're using yearbooks to certainly look for the yearbook where their subject person is a senior. You're often going to get a larger and higher quality photograph, as well as a better chance of a biographical statement or anecdote, which I'll also show some examples of. We'll also see portraits of faculty and staff members, and lots of group portraits showing various activities, clubs, sports and athletic teams, biographical statements, anecdotes, and academic awards, as well as academic interests. So the first example that I have is McClintock High School from Tempe, Arizona. This is the yearbook titled The Historian. This is another thing to keep in mind as we look at yearbooks, is a yearbook published by a school. It's very common that they'll have a nickname or a name of their yearbook, and it's very common that they'll stay with that name for many, many years, even perhaps until the school is torn down or perhaps rebuilt or renamed. So this is the Historian from 1973. Here's a typical page of what we'll see, a grid of individuals. In the lower left corner, you'll see that they give us a nice little footer here. In addition to the page number, we're also shown that these are seniors. So again, we know that these are students that were probably photographed when they were 17 and will be graduating when they're 18. This is in a nice alphabetical order. The previous page has a little different layout where there's an interstitial photograph in the upper right, but again, a very sort of common, or one of the more common types that you'll see is a grid where the name is right below the portrait. I'm showing this example because from the same yearbook over in the right-hand, lower right-hand side below this word handy, you see this very dense section of text. What they're doing here is they're giving us some very terse biographical or academic summaries of what these persons or these students were involved in. So for example, this first one about this Larry Farina, he was a class representative in all 4 years. He was in the Letterman's Club in his 4th year, and etc. So you kind of want to look around in these yearbooks to see what other information you can find. Some of these sort of biographical statements may not necessarily even be on the same page as the student's photograph or portrait. That an example, we see that here. So as we go into the juniors, this is again the very same yearbook. One thing you'll notice is that the photographs get smaller. This is a common thing you'll see where seniors, as I mentioned, sometimes have the biggest portraits, and then the juniors, and they get even smaller. So here are the juniors, a little different layout where the names are on the right with the rows of photographs to their left. Again, more juniors showing again, varying different types of layouts with photographs in various spots. We go into sophomores, and the photographs have gotten even smaller. And finally, I think this book also has freshmen with, again, quite small photographs, but again, really nice images that could certainly add to your family history and genealogy work. If your student or person of interest served in student body government or in prominent positions in clubs, they oftentimes may have a larger photograph like this. These are certainly very nice to see and important to look for as well. And then some examples of large group photographs. So at the top we have the JV football team. Here on this image we have the Pon girls in the bottom, again with their names. Sometimes it takes a minute or two to read the names and understand how they're being described. Look for things like them indicating where the back row is. Hopefully it's obvious that they're going from left to right. Sometimes they'll tell us that as well. Most of the yearbooks that you'll see in these online collections have been annotated by most likely the original owner. It's pretty rare to see a yearbook that is pristine or unwritten on. So this is an example of a yearbook that has some annotation in it. And then finally from this yearbook, some examples of some of the photographs of the faculty. You can imagine that if your family member or ancestor was a faculty member, year after year, you might have a yearly photograph of them that could be quite nice to add to your collection. The next example I want to show you is from Abbeville, Alabama. This is the 1955 edition of The Jacket. So we've gone back a little earlier, again, middle of 1950s. Here we're getting information about the faculty, some great additional details about their educational background, the degrees that they hold, with some of the information about the universities that they attended. We sometimes need to look for these pages that tell us what class these photographs are from. So it's often important to watch for these subtitle pages in a way that lead up to these photographic sections. In this example, this is telling us that the seniors are about to appear as we scroll through the book. And again, very nice photographs. They did have this sort of funny portrait technique I've seen where they're leaning into the camera, as you see on 5 of the 6 examples here. This one individual does have some writing across her torso. Again, an example of an annotated book that if that's your ancestor, you may wish that wasn't there. It's sort of luck of the draw. Again, others with annotation. But again, showing some really nice information for most of these individuals about the types of clubs and interests that they pursued during their high school career. Again, you're most commonly going to see that type of information with the seniors, and this practice did seem to fall out of some favor as you get into the late 60s and into the 1970s. So same yearbook, now we're into the juniors. Again, smaller photographs, again with names that hopefully are fairly easy to decode, which photograph belongs to which name. And then we get into the underclassmen. So we have sophomores. This high school or school also has freshmen, and it gets even better because they also have what we would call 8th grade or junior twos, as they're calling them. Quite small photographs, but still quite nice. And 7th grade or junior ones. And the next example I want to show is from the Santa Ana High School in Santa Ana, California. This is the 1945 aerial yearbook. Again, some great information about the administrators. Here's some vice principals. Some of the information on the faculty. Again, information about their professions and what they taught. Another example of a large group photograph. This is the French Club, Camera Club, Junior Red Cross. Again, you're going to see lots of these sophomores. So as a sophomore class president, this Mr. Bob Cole has a nice portrait. But in this book, and this is a fairly common thing that you'll see and need to deal with in earlier yearbooks, is only the seniors had their own individual portraits. In this example, this entire class of sophomores is taken in group photographs. So this school had a fairly large sophomore class. I think it takes a total of 6 of these group shots to get them all together. And so you'll need to read through these and look for the names of your specific person of interest. Even the same thing with juniors, I believe, in this book. They did not warrant at this time a separate individual portrait. And so we get the large group photographs again with a total of 3 on the first page, 3 on the second page, and 3 on the third page for the juniors. Then finally, we'll see seniors in this example from Alabama, or excuse me, this is Santa Clara, California. Again, why I always recommend try to find the yearbooks with your person of interest as a senior. You're more likely to find an individual and larger size portrait, as well as better information about their specific academic and extracurricular interests. Some examples, again, of seniors from this book from California. And that's interesting. At the bottom of this one, you'll see, I think, 8 individuals who are listed without photographs. Again, this was the year 1945, and I believe this is saying that 8 of their classmen are actively serving in the U.S. Navy. So they probably joined the Navy before they graduated high school, but the high school is still representing them here. Going a little bit earlier to another one from Alabama, the 1937 Empyrean from Huntsville. Nice information again about the faculty. It does kind of take some little bit of work to decode which name goes with which portrait, but hopefully is achievable by looking at the genders and the way that they're ordered. And then an example of seniors, and this is an example where we're starting to see some anecdotes or some biographical statements about sort of phrases that they may have wrote or wanted a quote contributed to them, also information about the clubs that they're involved with. Also, as we showed earlier, the juniors are lined up on the school steps, a very common thing you'll see, and taken with one large group photograph. This image does have some interesting scribbles over the photograph, so a little bit of damage in that regard. And the juniors also continue on the second page, and the sophomores even a more dense, larger group photograph. I think this is the entire sophomore class. They're together on the steps. And then the same thing with the freshmen. The school also had an 8th grade. Another example I wanted to show is this is a private school in Mayer, Arizona. This is from 1979. So in 1979, we're starting to see some nice color portrait photography. These are individuals from really all over the country and even from faraway countries. The bottom 2 is you'll see they're from Saudi Arabia, or at least that's where maybe their parents are living at the time. So here we're getting information about where these people perhaps reside permanently. It's not necessarily where they were born, but perhaps their permanent home residence when they're leaving this private school. This is a type of a boarding school where these students are coming and living on campus during the academic terms. Another example of a girl from California, a gentleman from Massachusetts, another lady from Arizona, and another guy from Arizona. The bottom right one shows an individual who claims she's from Algeria, so quite exotic. Again, you get wonderful information about their academic interests in some of these additional pages as well. These are showing us lower classmen or classmen that are not seniors, how about that? Giving us the year that they'll likely graduate, as well as the state and city where they reside. Another example, again from Alabama, the 1977 Crusader. Just to give you a feel for the types of things that you'll see. This is again, a private institution that's associated with some sort of Christian denomination. You'll see that the individuals here have chosen specific scripture verses from the Bible that they've listed here with these short biographical statements. Wonderful pictures again of individuals. The portrait photography is really what we're after as one of our main objectives when we're looking at these yearbooks. So the school also had sophomores, freshmen, 8th grade, 7th grade, and one reason why I chose this example is this is one of the rare cases where we even have elementary school students included, 6th grade, 5th grade, 4th, 3rd, 2nd, or 2nd class A, 2nd and 1st, and the kindergarten. So a very broad range of students' ages in this particular book. And then finally, nearing the end of the examples, I wanted to show some examples of anecdotes or these biographical statements. So here's the Paysonian. This is at the time in 1955, a fairly small town south of the town where I grew up here in Orem, Utah. You see that has information about even what type of car these two boys drive. Has to arise early. I think this may be a reference to some of the dairy farms that I know existed at the time near Payson. And he's been seen with Barbara, maybe a particular girl of interest. These bottom two are quite interesting. Right next to each other, we have a Larita Throckmorton and a Myrna Throckmorton. And we learn in their little biographical statements that they're cousins of each other. Mira is claimed to be the sidekick of Larita. So just some really fun and interesting facts or information you can get from these little anecdotes or biographical statements. Also from both of these examples, we've learned that these two bottom individuals are from Genola. This is a small agricultural community near Payson that was sending its students to the high school in Payson for their education. Finally, an example of a larger sort of biographical statement. The top one is the famous actor Jimmy Stewart. He's one of the example records we actually used when we published our collection on MyHeritage, with an example on the bottom of a Ross Watson Thompson. Both of these examples show at the bottom of their statements the word Princeton. This is referring to the fact that they were planning on attending Princeton University. This appeared to be a very prestigious prep school there in Mercerburg, Pennsylvania. All right, so let's talk about some search strategies, and then I'll show you just a few live examples as we get near the end here. All right, so finding school names in yearbooks. So Wikipedia is really going to be your friend as you try to dive deeper into these school yearbooks. So for example, if I wanted to understand what high schools might exist, I'm going to look, for example, at Syracuse, New York. So as the fount of all truth and knowledge, Wikipedia gives us all sorts of information, but most articles about cities will have the section on education and often the subsection of primary and secondary schools. And here we're given some information about another Wikipedia article that's the Syracuse City School District. Sometimes you'll also see here on this main article about the city or town a list of the high schools and secondary schools that are in the city. So if we go to this article, we get a nice list here of the high schools that are in the city, and we can start to research some of the history of these. So the Institute of Central Technology, it looks like it was a fairly older building. So this is one way that I'll often try to find out information about high schools in certain cities. I'll show an example where you start to need to understand what high schools were built and what high schools were torn down and superseded one another. Let's also talk a little bit about searching for students, and I'll show some examples in just a moment as we do some brief live demonstration. But it's important to remember that the girls or the female students will be using their maiden surnames. So you certainly want to think about the surname that they had as a child and continue to use that for your searching for them in yearbooks. Students may be using a variant of their given name that you may not think to try. So one thing I suggest here is always try also searching just by the surname and see what people you get in the yearbook. Sometimes you'll find surprises like even siblings or cousins that you did not expect. And some tips for searching for faculty and staff. So the women staff will be using either their maiden names or surnames, or excuse me, their maiden surnames or their married surnames based on their marital status. So it's not uncommon to see a young lady faculty member have her surname changed because she got married. And then sort of an important caveat that I wanted to point out is all of the digital collections that you'll see and that I'll reference in just a moment are produced with a process called optical character recognition, or OCR. So this is a process where a computer reads printed machine printed text, as the example I'm showing on the left, and deduces digital searchable text, as I'm showing on the right. So oftentimes this works very well, but there are cases where it doesn't work so well. Here's an example of some work we've done here at MyHeritage to try to solve some of these problems, and I'm showing just a brief example of the given name William. So here in this first column on the left, I'm showing what we believe to be mis-OCR versions of this given name William. And this continues on actually for quite some ways. There's way more than this than I'm showing. And so this, I'm wanting to point out to you here that if your person is named William and if the OCR was struggling on that word on the particular page you're hoping to get a hit on, you may have some difficulty finding them. This also happens with surnames, and so we'll talk about some strategies. Really when the OCR is failing you or failing to help you in the search, what you can also do. And one of the most important ones that I would point out is this example that I'm showing. In many of the yearbooks, if you go to the back of the yearbook through the browse mechanism that you'll invariably find, you can often find an index. So in this particular index, I'm showing a list of the students and perhaps even faculty that are shown in the yearbook, and I'm given a list of the pages that they occur on. So using these indexes can help you find additional pages where a search system may miss because of these challenges in producing near perfect OCR. That's really a very hard computational problem to have a perfect OCR output. All right, so as we talk about search strategy, I want to give you just a brief overview of what happened in my own case. So I'm showing you here at the bottom two photographs of high schools. The one on the left is Lincoln High School, and the one on the right is Orem High School. This is the city where I grew up and attended high school. So Lincoln was the school that preceded Orem, or the Orem High School. So you see in the year 1957, Lincoln High School stopped being a high school, and all the students in the secondary education grades started to attend this new high school that they had built that was called Orem High School. The physical building that Lincoln High had occupied became Lincoln Junior High. So you can still find some Lincoln Junior High School yearbooks as well from the time when it served as a junior high. And over on the right, I'm showing you the wealth of information that I can find when I get into a nice series of yearbooks such as this one, where in 1951 I'm able to find my father, 3 years later my mother, my dad's brother, my Uncle Jay, Jay's future wife, my Aunt Norma, my dad's sister, Karen, my dad's other sister, Darlene, and then we start to get into some of my older brothers and older cousins, my brother Mark, and my oldest cousin Jan, my brother Paul and Peggy, my cousin Shelley, and then my brother Steve. So when you find a site that has yearbooks for the community that you're interested in, I certainly encourage you to look widely. Think of all those people in your tree, your cousins, your in-laws even, people of interest, and you can certainly find some great information about them. Another thing I would point out here is these are all of the yearbooks that we have in at least our collection here at MyHeritage for Lincoln High School and Orem High from 1950 to 1979, and you'll notice that there are some gaps. So one caveat I'd also mention in these yearbook collections is I've never seen, and there has yet to be, a completely perfect yearbook collection where all high schools are represented and all years are represented. You may certainly find a school that has a very almost complete year, even a complete year, but the school, say down the street from it, might be completely absent from the collection. So in this case, I'm getting some nice success, even though there are gaps, some as many as 5 or even 6 year gaps between some of these yearbooks in the collection, at least this collection that we have on MyHeritage, which is actually one of the larger collections, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. So let's talk about digitized school yearbooks, and we'll first look at some collections at paid sites and services. I'll mention the one on MyHeritage, and this is the one I'm most familiar with, so I'll spend a little bit more time on it. Ancestry also has a nice collection, as does two sort of adjacent industries to the genealogy domain, Classmates and eYearbook, which I'll talk about in just a moment. We'll also talk about how to find some digitized school books at free sites, including the Internet Archive, also known as archive.org, and the Digital Public Library of America is a good finding aid, and then also how to find some success in smaller digital library initiatives. So when I go to MyHeritage, when I log in, I'll go to the Research tab over here on the top right, and one way to find this, I can also use our collection catalog, but it's also here in our category structure under schools and universities. If I click that link near the bottom right, I'll be taken to a page that looks like this, where I'll see these two yearbook collections. These are fairly new collections. The first one was released the day before Christmas, just this last year, and the last one was released just in late February. What we did at MyHeritage is we wanted to do something special with this collection. So after we released the initial one, which has sort of this free text OCR index, we did quite a bit of work over the next few months to develop what's called a name index, and that's why you see we have a second one listed. So if I were to click on the top one, I would be taken to this page where I could search by names, and what the system's doing here, it's going to use the terms I put in the first and middle names box and the last name box with some intelligence about term proximity to try to find terms that were within a certain distance of each other to sort of simulate how a name would appear. I can also filter by schools, the year in which the yearbook was published, the school location, and other keywords. An example of a keyword search might be saying, I want to find something about football teams, or the valedictorian of a certain school in a certain year. The keyword search in this collection could be very helpful in doing some of those searches that are not necessarily just based on names. The other collection that I mentioned is this one that we call the U.S. Yearbook Name Index. Again, both these collections have the same number of yearbooks in them, these 253,429 yearbooks. Just a really, really large collection. We're so happy with this collection and very proud of its usefulness really to our users, and we hope you enjoy it. But here in this collection, what we did is we did quite a bit of algorithmic processing to actually spot and identify given names and surnames and to relate those to each other in a record. And I'll show you an example of how this works right now. So let me switch over to a web browser. I'm going to come to MyHeritage, again here on Super Search. Here at the top I can click on, I'm here on the Research tab. If I come down to schools and universities, I'll see this collection for U.S. Yearbooks name index. And if I click here, I can do a search. Let's do this one that I've looked at. This is a person named Mary Nell, and I want to look for yearbooks that were published in 1974. So we get some interesting results here, and I want to point out some additional capabilities we built into this name index version of this yearbook collection. You'll see not only do we show you thumbnails of where this individual appears, and I'll show you the individual record view in just a moment, but you'll also see some additional thumbnails below the record. And let me show you what we want you to understand by those when we go into the individual record view. So here we get the name of this person that I searched for, Mary Nell. She attended Dixie High School. This is in the very southwest corner of the state of Utah, almost near Las Vegas in St. George. She's a senior here. This is another work we also did, is whenever we could, we tried to infer and spot the grade. This helps us also imply or compute a birth year. So we're giving us an indication that this individual was born approximately in 1957 and that she is a senior listed here. So if I scroll down, you'll see that she's listed here in the bottom left. I could scroll in to look at the full screen, but also at the bottom here, two additional things I want to point out. Here under all occurrences, and this work that we've done earlier this year, we also grouped together all occurrences of Mary Nell in this specific yearbook. So she exists on 5 pages, here on page 31, which is this one that we're looking at here at the top. Also here on page, so I guess she was a cheerleader, also here on page 88, page 108, so you see how that works. I can kind of click through, and we're hopeful that you'll see that you can more easily find all the occurrences, or many of the occurrences. Again, the caveats that I made about OCR quality are still appropriate. We've done this work to be as good as we can, but we know that there'll be cases where a human doing intelligent searching will be able to exceed the work that we did algorithmically. So this is a very nice example of where this individual is listed in no fewer than 5 occurrences here in this yearbook, and I can go and look at all of those. And then also down at the bottom here, we've built in some smarts or intelligence to show you or to lead you to other yearbooks that are really from the same high school that predate this senior, and if the person is not a senior, we would list other dates around that person that might be of interest to you. So this would, if I click on one of these examples, this would do what we call sort of a query search for me, and it should land me on the 1973 version of the yearbook, where I can see Mary Nell as a junior. Yep, so here she is. He's a junior. Again, we have the same estimated birth year. And down at the bottom, I'm going to get a different set. Again, she's quite a popular girl. Looks like she's appearing in 5 pages here of her yearbook. And as you can see down here, the related yearbooks change. So I'm getting the year before her junior year as well as the year after, or her senior year, which we just looked at. So that's just some really brief introduction to the yearbook collection here at MyHeritage. Again, I'm going to the research tab, show you again how to find it, go down to schools and universities. 2 collections with the same underlying content. One of the largest collections, if not perhaps the largest collection that's been digitized and published in our industry, and we're very hopeful that you're going to have a wonderful time with it. Let's move on. So here at Ancestry, and I'm not going to spend too much time looking at these other examples, but I'll talk a little bit about what I do know of these other collections. So here in Ancestry, under the Search tab, one way that I find their collections, I'll go to the card catalog. They have a nice card catalog feature there. And here in the upper left, I'll enter the word yearbook, and I'll do a search. And this will filter their collections by titles that have the word yearbook or perhaps yearbooks in it. And this top one here, U.S. School Yearbooks, is the collection that you'll find at Ancestry. It has about 100, they claim 160,000 books. So again, a very nice large size collection. The 2 other vendors that I mentioned are Classmates. Classmates is an interesting website. If you haven't been there recently, I maybe encourage you to go look at it. It feels like it's a social network hiding a yearbook collection, or it's a website with a yearbook collection posing as a social network. I'm not sure exactly which, but it's kind of a freemium site where you can join for free, and for a free user you can browse and peruse much of their yearbook content. It's a little difficult, and there will quite a bit of advertising you'll have to wade through, and sort of prompts for you to enter information about your profile so that they can put you in their social network. But they do have some premium plans. Most of these premium plans are to enable features that increase your ability to participate in their social network. Another site that I think is interesting is Yearbookcom. Fairly affordable. They have a $20 per year service subscription, or you can also buy a 2-month minimum monthly subscription for just under $5. Another site that I would encourage you to look at, let's look at it just briefly. So here at Yearbooks, for example, they do have a really nice browse mechanism where I can very quickly see the schools that they have. So here I'm in, I think, the state of Alabama. Let's go to my home state, or the state of Utah. I can scroll through the schools here on the left. I recognize most, if not all, of these high schools. Unfortunately, in this case, they don't have any yearbooks from Orem High School, the high school that I attended. Here's a school just down the road from me, and they have one book from Timpview High School in Provo, Utah from 1982. It's kind of a nose frill site. It's pretty basic, but it is pretty good at what it does, and that's lets you see yearbooks and see what they have and browse through them. So I encourage you to take a look at yearbook.com as well. Let's talk just for a moment about free services. So there's archive.org, or the Internet Archive. If I do a search for high school yearbook, as I'm showing here, I'll find well over 10,000 results. And there are certainly some unique and interesting high school yearbooks you can find there for free on Internet Archive. Another free service is the Digital Public Library of America, also known as DPLA. I'm showing here an example where I searched again for high school yearbook, and I'm getting results, over 5,000 results. Not all of these will necessarily be yearbooks, but of interest nonetheless. And then finally, you can often find other digital library initiatives, smaller ones that you may not know about. So here's an example where I'm searching for Google for Tigerama. That's the title of the Orem High School where I went to school. And I got this very interesting result for a local university here in the valley called Utah Valley University that you can see there in the URL. And it looks like they've received some sort of grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. You see that at the bottom, where they've been digitizing some of their junior high and high school yearbooks from the city of Orem. So a wonderful resource for me. I'd encourage you, though, to look around your local universities, larger public libraries that are doing digital publication initiatives, and you may see that they'll often rate these school yearbooks pretty highly on their prioritization list, because these are fairly unique and rare materials that they may be the only institution that's actively collected these. Let's talk just a moment also about finding hard copy yearbooks. So for public viewing, certainly recommend looking at your local public libraries. Many libraries would accession or purchase copies of their school's yearbooks in their communities, and they may have them in their stacks, or sometimes they're in closed stacks. I know at my public library they moved them to closed stacks. I assume maybe they were getting cut up a little bit too much, or maybe vandalized. Also look at local college and university libraries. They may also collect these types of local yearbooks that are of great interest to us as genealogists. And then finally, and I haven't actually tried this, but I imagine if you went to a high school and politely asked the secretary at the front desk or the administration if you could be given a chance to look at their library and what they have in their high school library, I would be surprised if a reasonable librarian would bar a member of the public from getting some access to the yearbooks that they almost certainly have in their school library. Another large online catalog is called WorldCat. This is a union catalog of many, many thousand libraries, academic libraries, public libraries, and you can often search across again, you're going to be able to search across the country for yearbooks that could be held in libraries very far distant from you. Now, most of these yearbooks held by a public library do not circulate, so you would likely not have success getting these through interlibrary loan. But if you're extremely desperate, then this is where you find a local friend, or maybe you hire a local researcher to visit that library in that distant community or city to access that yearbook for you. And then sometimes I do get the question, what about the Library of Congress? They seem like they certainly have one of the most comprehensive collection development practices and policies. And unfortunately, this is one of the few types of published materials that they did not actively collect or accession. I've found very, very few school yearbooks there at the Library of Congress. There are some ways that you can purchase yearbooks if you're really desperate. One of the main sites that I look at is Yearbooks. If you haven't seen this website, I encourage you to take a look at it. It's a large network of independent booksellers, used and new independent booksellers around the country and even across the globe. This is a site that was purchased by Amazon, so they're actually a separate company but owned by Amazon. And you can certainly go to Yearbooks, type in the name of a high school's yearbook or a high school name, and you'll see many, perhaps thousands of yearbooks are available there at Yearbooks. Used books, both at Yearbooks and eBay, often go in the range of anywhere as maybe as cheap as $10 through perhaps several $100s, with the average price being probably around $30 to $40, and you're going to pay an additional $5 to $10 in shipping. The most expensive yearbooks, I've seen people where there's maybe a really famous celebrity in the yearbook, they're maybe asking for a premium price for those types of examples. And then finally, just in the last few moments I have with you, just a few statements about copyrights and school yearbooks. Very complicated copyright law we have here in the United States, but basically if I boil it down, if you look at this slide in detail, any books published before 1923 are 100% guaranteed to be in the public domain. And the great news, if they were published before 1963, they're almost certainly to be in the public domain. The only exceptions would be if they actually did copyright the yearbook, which in my experience most of these schools were not. But if they did copyright it, and if they didn't renew their copyright at the end of the 27th year, then it has elapsed into the public domain. So most yearbooks, probably 99%, that have been published prior to 1964 are in the public domain. As you go forward, it gets a little bit more complicated based on whether or not they had a proper copyright notice, or whether or not they had a copyright notice and registered their copyright. It can get a little complicated, but I would recommend to us as genealogists and family historians that we're going to be pretty safe in our use of these materials, as mostly what we'll be doing is easily considered to be fair use. And I'll refer you to the article at the bottom where Judy Russell, this sort of expert in our field, has this great blog I would also recommend you called The Legal Genealogist. She has this article from 2014 where she talks about some of the factors that we need to consider in copyright and yearbooks. But again, to set your minds at ease, even for books that are in copyright, we're almost certainly going to be in fair use. Where you may hit gray areas if you're trying to republish books like we've done, or Ancestry, or Classmates, that's where you start to get in some more difficult areas with the more recent yearbooks. With that, I'm at an end. I hope you're excited about this source. Again, my name is Mike Mansfield, and here's my email address. I'm happy to hear from you if we don't get a chance to exchange comments today. And with that, let me turn it back to Jeff.
Okay, Mike, thank you very much, and a very enjoyable class. My kids just got their yearbooks just yesterday, and so it's fun to look at them, fun to look back at my own. I've found lots of good stuff actually in your new yearbook collection at MyHeritage. Glad that it's there. Let me switch this over to me, Mike, and we're going to do a couple of door prizes, and then we'll come back to questions. Here's the list of the upcoming live webinars Next on the plate is coming up in, let's see, in 2 weeks, how to use the smart matches and record matches MyHeritage technologies, followed by digital gravestones. And then you need a search strategy maximizing your results with online genealogical databases. And Mike, I think that one's you on June 19th. Looking forward to that as well. Very good. And let's do door prize time. So one of the questions here before I announce our first winner, Mike, was from Adria, who's wondering. Well, I guess you did cover this about the free versus freemium or fee sites to access the yearbook collection at MyHeritage. That would be part of the use of a data subscription. Is that correct? What I've got shown here.
That's correct. Either the data subscription or the data bundled with our tree services, often called our premium package, to form what's called a complete subscription. So either the data or the complete will give you access to the yearbooks.
Okay, good. And by the way, instead of doing a 1-year MyHeritage data subscription, we're actually I'm changing that to a complete subscription. So these 2 door prizes I'll be giving away will include everything up at MyHeritage. Okay, if you would like to be considered for the complete subscription here, go ahead and click on that hand-raising button. It's found there in the upper left of your webinar control panel. Give it a click, and that'll show me that you are interested. And then I'll go and I'll have my random picker, door prize picker, go and find you. And we're almost there. Okay, our first winner, we have Barbara Ware. And if I call your name, just watch for an email from us, and that's how you'll know what to do. Okay, my next screen, same screen. We're going to do another complete subscription. Love door prize time. It's a fun way to thank you for being here, and every once in a while you get lucky. Our next winner, we have Susan Snyder. Susan, congratulations. Thanks for being here today. And we'll keep on going here. Okay, and there's my questions slide. So, Mike, so we've got some good questions here. One of them, our first one here, has to do with the primary versus secondary evidence that you were discussing. Maureen says that some yearbooks list the actual street address of seniors. She's just wondering, would that information be considered primary or secondary, that address?
Yeah, so one of the main aspects I would consider is how likely is the information to have been provided in chronological time to the event. And you could argue that it was almost certainly provided by a parent or a student to the school, so it's likely to be very chronologically close and therefore highly accurate. I would say it's likely to be considered primary.
Okay. There you go, Maureen. Thanks for your question, and thanks, Mike. What about Adria is also wondering, do any of these yearbook sites have yearbooks from other countries?
That is a good question. We have a very small number of Canadian yearbooks in this collection. We actually debated if we should pull them out and have a smaller set of Canada. I think it's fewer than 200 of the over 253,000. Another important thing that I would mention is our collection at MyHeritage. We have a decent number of American schools that were serving students in overseas locations. These were mostly students attached to military bases or large diplomatic facilities such as consulates and embassies. So we do have students of Americans serving, students that were attending high school in Panama, various countries in Europe, really around the globe. So there are some of those, again, not a large number, just probably a few hundred of those.
Okay.
I do know that the high schools in Canada did follow the practice in the United States, and there are some interesting examples you can find. I think Ancestry may have a specific Canadian yearbook collection from some of the work that they have done.
Okay, thank you. And Catherine writes in saying, I just found the yearbooks on MyHeritage last night and was thrilled she found many pictures of her cousins. So, Catherine, I'm happy for you. Thanks for sharing that. Cassandra's wondering, is it possible, can she submit her yearbook to get it added to a digital collection if it's not already there?
Yeah, this is a great question, and one that I was thinking would be asked, because I have been asked this question before. Do we take donations? The short answer is not at this time, but it's something that we're thinking about.
Huh.
One way that you reduce the cost of digitizing these yearbooks is you generally want to cut the binding off of them. A large sort of paper guillotine process. This lets you then scan the pages in a much quicker and less labor-intensive method. So most of the time the yearbooks get a little destroyed, if not almost completely destroyed by this process. I mean, they still exist as a pile of papers, but they're no longer bound. So we'd have to figure out, is this a process where people are sending us a hard copy and they want it back? We certainly have book scanners that aren't destructive, or is the end user saying they could maybe take the book to a decent facility with a book scanner? Many larger public libraries have these now for patrons to use, and scan it on their own and send us the digital files. That would be a different variable.
Yeah. Okay.
So the answer is not yet. If the demand does continue to exist, then it'd be an interesting project to look at.
Yeah, it would. Yeah, Cindy writes in saying it's sad seeing a yearbook in a garage sale. It would be a great addition to your efforts. So thanks, Cindy, for sharing that. Melinda's wondering, so if you find a photograph in one of these digital collections, she's wondering, is there a way to download the pictures from the site?
Yeah, so MyHeritage and I believe Ancestry and the other sites. So one thing, you can always take a screen capture of the photograph, and there's software that can help you do that. And then at MyHeritage, and I believe the other sites are similar, is you should be able to download the photograph. I know at MyHeritage we let you do this. You're welcome to download the entire. It's really the page. The underlying photographs are not segmented or separated in that way. Yeah, so you're certainly welcome to download these images of these pages and use them in your work. Absolutely.
Okay, and we've got some viewers writing in talking about the snipping tool to save photos. I think the snipping tool is part of Windows. What's the one that Snagit? I use Snagit on mine.
Snagit's a good one. There's a free software download that I use a lot called IrfanView. It's got a funny name, IrfanView. It does a lot of different things for graphic files, but also has a fairly nice and robust screen capture option. You can capture entire screens or even just pieces that you would highlight, for example, and it will create those files or help you create those files.
Okay, thanks. And so I've included that in the chat log, but other viewers have also written in with some more suggestions, so I've responded and put those in the chat log also. And Dawn says she finds yearbooks at thrift stores for only a couple of dollars each, so sounds like Dawn's enjoyed that.
There you go. Maybe a little business would be buy them cheap and sell them on eBay for more. I don't know. Never actually tried it, but
now we're thinking. Okay. Now, what about this question from Charlotte, who says, what's the best way to determine whether a particular yearbook year was or was not published?
That's a really good question. There is no, like I said, master catalog that we can, sort of appeal to at Library of Congress. I would really start with the school, see what they have in really the school library.
Yeah, it seems like they'd probably know the best, huh?
Yeah, try to find those local repositories, these local libraries that were likely to collect them. Even if that version of the book is missing from the library's collection, because perhaps it was stolen or lost, they still may have information about it in their catalog.
Okay. All right. What about this question from Edward, who's wondering, have you ever run into military service yearbooks? Edward says in his case there was one issued for basic training, one for airborne school, and one issued for military academy preparatory school.
Yeah, I've also seen a similar type of yearbook that the Navy issued. It was called a Navy cruise book. For these longer naval deployments, my understanding is they would often produce a type of a yearbook for the persons aboard ship. They certainly exist. We could also talk about alumni directories. Again, I'm kind of going beyond scope here. Yeah, there are all sorts of yearbooks, and if you do a lot of searching or Googling online, you're going to see that yearbook can actually mean a lot of different things. It can also mean a type of a statistical summary. So as you're weeding through various online sources, you'll pretty soon understand the differences between these sort of school photographic yearbooks that I focused on today versus these other types. But yeah, there are universities that produced yearbooks like we've focused on here from high schools, but certainly not nearly to the same degree. It's pretty rare in my experience to find robust sets of college yearbooks that have this level of sort of photographic detail. They exist, but certainly not to the same rate that we see with the high schools.
Okay. And let's see, Cindy writes in talking about high school newspapers might be another one of those types of related records. A little bit outside of the scope, though. Cassandra's wondering, are yearbooks, do they show up in the record matches at MyHeritage? If you have either a tree there or a tree in legacy, would those databases hit against the yearbooks?
So that's a very good question, and we are working on some. So specifically, the answer right now is not yet.
Okay.
We're working on some changes and tweaks to our record matching system to better support yearbooks. We've done some testing, and we were somewhat dissatisfied with the results. So I can say it's on the roadmap for later this year. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed that we'll be able to get the engineers working on the problem again in the next number of months.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, if you don't see record matches to this collection, please don't be surprised. I'd encourage you to do some ad hoc searching. But yeah, those record matches are something that we're working towards supporting in the very near future.
Oh, good. Looking forward to that. I've had a few questions about yearbooks during war years. Some have suggested that to save costs, that yearbooks just were non-existent during war years. Do you have any experience with that, Mike?
I haven't done a deep study. I've wanted to take the time, but it's a big project to really try to develop a better understanding of really as many high schools as possible and their publication practices. It wouldn't surprise me for an instance that some schools did elect to forego publication of a yearbook, or if maybe they're just so small or there wasn't enough interest in the yearbook class in a certain year that they just decided to skip. So it would not surprise me if there are gaps during, say, especially during World War II. During World War I, yearbooks were still fairly new, and quite a few schools had not started to publish them even that early.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mike. Well, Mike, we've got down through the end of the list of our questions here. You've done very well.
Awesome.
Any final thoughts or anything else you've just got to get off your chest here before we say goodbye?
No, I would just say that it's been really fun developing this material, and it's kind of reignited a fire in me to use this really rich and kind of unique source. It can help put some interesting information in our genealogy, in our family trees, and they're a fun and amazing source. Yeah.
Well, very good.
I hope you enjoy it.
Yeah. Thanks, Mike. Sure appreciate it. And we'll have this online. You can go back, watch this again, share it with others you know. But thanks to you, Mike, and thanks to all of you around the world, wherever and whenever you are. Thanks to everyone for sharing part of your day with us. And remember, life is short. Do genealogy first. Bye, everyone. Bye, Mike. Thanks.
Goodbye. Thanks.